Okay, let's dive in. Today we're tackling a really pivotal moment in history, the French Revolution, a period that just completely turned France upside down and really changed the world stage.
Absolutely. And we're doing this using the source material you, our listener, provided that detailed article from history.com.
Right, and it's a great source to work with.
It is. And as the article rightly points out, this wasn't just some internal French affair. It calls it a watershed event
Hmm.
in world history. It fundamentally ripped up France's political map, getting rid of institutions that had been there for
Like
centuries.
the monarchy, the whole feudal system.
Exactly. Centuries old. Gone.
So, our mission today is to use this history.com article as our map, navigating through that incredibly turbulent decade. We want to pull out the key moments, the causes, the really radical shifts for you.
Tracing it all from, say, 1789 through the late 1790s, right up to Napoleon stepping in.
Yeah, the aim is to get you up to speed on this complex time, quickly but properly.
And we'll see, drawing on the source, just how fast these deep-rooted systems could be dismantled.
Hmm.
And also the struggle, often pretty violent, to figure out what came next.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. According to the source, what was France actually like towards the end of the 18th century?
Well, the picture it paints is pretty grim. A kingdom in serious trouble. Financially, this source says France was on the brink of bankruptcy.
On the brink. Why? What were the main reasons?
Two big ones highlighted in the article. First, France's support for the American Revolution. Hugely expensive, drained the coffers. Second, King Louis VI's own, extravagant spending didn't help matters.
Okay, so the government's broke. But what about the ordinary people? How are things for them on the ground?
Dire. Absolutely dire. And it made the government's problems worse. The source mentions several years of just awful luck, bad harvests, drought, even cattle disease,
Which means,
which means skyrocketing bread prices. Bread was the staple food, you see.
so if bread becomes unaffordable, that's a disaster for most people.
Complete disaster. Imagine that your basic food, suddenly out of reach. So the source makes it clear, this wasn't just hardship. It bred this deep, deep resentment
Resentment against who?
against the regime, the system. Peasants, the urban poor, they felt desperate. They're paying heavy taxes, getting no relief, while the wealthy, the nobles, are often exempt.
And that resentment boiled over.
Yeah. The article mentions rioting, looting, strikes. People were pushed to the edge.
Okay, bankrupt state, angry population, the king needs cash. What does his finance guy, Calonne, propose? This is around 1786.
Charles Alexander de Cullen, yeah. He comes up with a financial reform package. And this is where you see the elite starting to clash. His big idea, a universal land tax.
Universal meaning everyone pays.
Everyone. Crucially, the aristocratic classes would no longer be exempt.
Ooh, I can imagine how that went down with the nobles.
Exactly. They'd had those privileges for centuries.
Huh.
They were not about to give them up easily. They resisted.
So how did the king try to get around them?
He had to resort to something drastic. Something that hadn't been done since, what, 1614?
He calls the estates general.
Or les États Généraux, yes.
Yeah.
The old assembly. It represented the three estates. The clergy were the first estate, the nobility the second.
And everyone else, the vast majority, was the third estate.
Right. Middle class, peasants, workers,
Yeah.
everyone else.
And before they met, these delegates drew up lists of complaints, the Cahiers de Doléances. What did those show?
They showed a widespread hunger for reform, definitely.
Hmm.
But they also really exposed the fundamental problem with the Estates General itself.
Which was?
Well, the source points out this massive demographic shift. The third estate now represented something like 98% of the population. 98%.
Wow. But under the old rules, they could still be outvoted by the other two estates, couldn't they, if they voted by order?
Precisely. Voting by status, not by head. And that became the absolute flashpoint. The third estate realized this wasn't just about fixing finances anymore.
It was about power, real representation.
Yes. They started demanding equal representation. They wanted voting by head and not by status. And they wanted to get rid of the noble veto, that power the second estate had.
So this meeting, called to solve a money crisis, immediately turns into a fight over the structure of French society itself.
Completely. The source says the voting debate caused open hostility. It just, pushed the original agenda aside. Third estate saw they were getting nowhere.
So they took matters into their own hands, June 17th.
Big move. They met alone, broke away, and basically declared themselves the National Assembly.
Effectively saying, we represent the nation.
Yes, a radical claim of popular sovereignty,
Yeah.
taking legitimacy away from the old system. And then a few days later, they get locked out of their meeting hall.
And they end up in that indoor tennis court,
Right. And they swear the famous tennis court oath, the Serment du jeu de paume,
vowing not to leave
until France had a constitution,
Hmm?
a new framework for government. It was a hugely defiant act.
Oh, it worked in a way.
It gained momentum. The source says within a week, most of the clergy deputies and even 47 liberal nobles had joined them. The pressure was immense.
And Louis XVI.
He had to give in, though the source says he did so grudgingly. On June 27th, he ordered all three estates to join this new National Assembly.
Which then became the National Constituent Assembly, right? Tasked with writing that constitution.
Exactly. A new body for a new France, supposedly.
Okay, so while all this political maneuvering is happening in Versailles, drafting constitutions and so on, what's the mood back in Paris? Things weren't calm there, were they?
Far from it. The source describes the atmosphere as thick with fear and violence. There were rumors flying around,
Rumors of what?
specifically an impending military coup. People feared the king was bringing troops in to shut down the assembly to crush the changes.
And that fear leads to action.
It ignites. It leads to a popular uprising, culminating on July 14th.
The storming of the Bastille.
That's the one. Now, the immediate aim, the source notes, was pretty practical. They needed gunpowder and weapons, and they thought they'd find them there.
But storming the Bastille, this old fortress, a symbol of royal power, that was huge symbolically, wasn't it?
Oh, immense. Many people, as the source says, see that day as the real start of the French Revolution. It's France's national holiday now, Bastille Day. It was the people of Paris taking decisive, violent action.
And did that energy stay contained in Paris?
Not at all. It spread like wildfire. The source talks about revolutionary fervor and widespread hysteria sweeping across the whole country.
Leading to something called the Great Fear, the Grand Peur.
Yes, the Great Fear. This was basically the revolution hitting the countryside.
An uprising by the peasants.
An agrarian insurrection, exactly.
Right.
Peasants who'd been exploited for generations, fed up with taxes, landlords, the whole system. They rose up. The article mentions them looting and burning the homes of tax collectors, landlords, the local nobility.
So the countryside is having its own violent reckoning with the old feudal order.
Pretty much, yeah. And this chaos in the countryside had a couple of major effects. It definitely sped up the number of nobles fleeing France, the exodus, as the source calls it.
And the other effect.
It pushed the National Constituent Assembly in Versailles to act decisively.
How so? What did they do?
August 4th, 1789. A massive night.
Yeah.
They formally abolished feudalism.
Abolished it. Just like that.
Just like that. All the old feudal rights, dues, privileges, gone. The source quotes a historian calling it the death certificate of the old order. You really can't overstate how huge that was. It fundamentally changed the structure of rural France overnight.
Wow. Okay, so feudalism is gone. The old order is declared dead. What's going to replace it? What principles are guiding this new France?
Well, shortly after abolishing feudalism, in late August, the Assembly adopts another landmark document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen.
Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen. This is the famous one, laying out the ideals.
Exactly, a statement of democratic principles. The source connects it directly to Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
What did it proclaim?
Its goal was to replace the old regime, the ancient regime, with a system based on things like equal opportunity, freedom of speech, popular sovereignty, and representative government. Really lofty, radical ideas for the time.
So you have these incredible ideals on paper, but turning them into a functioning government, a constitution, that wasn't easy.
No, it was incredibly challenging. Remember, the Assembly's trying to write this fundamental law while also trying to govern the country during harsh economic times, massive social upheaval.
A tough juggling act.
Very tough.
Yeah.
And the source highlights these big fundamental questions they were grappling with, like who actually gets to vote? What about the church? Should clergy be loyal to Rome or the new French government? And crucially, what role, if any, should the king have? How much power does he keep?
And King Louis VI wasn't exactly making himself popular during this period, was he?
Not at all. His attempt to flee the country in June 1791, that was a disaster for him. It shattered a lot of remaining trust and really weakened his position.
Yet the first constitution they finally adopted, September 3rd, 1791, it still included a king.
It did. It established a constitutional monarchy. The source suggests this was pushed by the more moderate voices in the assembly. The king got to keep some power, a royal veto, appointing ministers.
A compromise, then. Keep the monarchy, but limit it. Did that satisfy everyone?
Not by a long shot. It deeply disappointed the more radical figures. The source names people like Maximilien de Robespierre, Camille Desmoulins, George Danton.
What did they want?
They wanted a republic, no king at all, and they wanted Louis XVI put on trial. So this constitution, this compromise, just papered over these deep divisions. The tension between moderates and radicals was only growing.
And that tension is about to explode, isn't it? Leading to a much more extreme phase.
It really is. Things take a sharp turn in April 1792. The new government body, the Legislative Assembly, makes a huge decision. They declare war.
War. On who? And why now? Things were already so unstable inside France.
They declared war on Austria and Prussia. The thinking, according to the source, was twofold. One, they believed French nobles who'd fled the émigrés were plotting counter-revolution with help from Austria and Prussia. Two, maybe more ambitiously, they hoped to spread the revolution's ideals beyond France's borders through war.
A massive gamble. And how did things go domestically after declaring war?
Things deteriorated fast. The political crisis at home took a radical turn, as the source puts it. War fever, suspicion, fear of enemies within. It all intensified.
And this leads to another major event in Paris.
August 10th, 1792. Insurgents, led by the extremist Jacobins, stormed the royal palace, the Tuileries in Paris. They arrested the king. That's pretty much the violent end of the monarchy in practice.
And the violence didn't stop there.
No, tragically. The following month, September, saw what the source calls a terrible wave of violence. Parisian mobs, fueled by fear and paranoia, dragged hundreds of prisoners, priests, nobles, suspected royalists, counter-revolutionaries from jails, and massacred them. The September massacres.
Just awful. And politically, what happens?
The Legislative Assembly is tossed aside. A new body, the National Convention, is elected. Its first major acts: formally abolish the monarchy, declare France a republic.
So, no more king, officially. What happens to Louis XVI, who was arrested back in August?
His fate is sealed. The convention tries him for treason. On January 21, 1793, he's executed by guillotine, condemned to death for high treason and crimes against the state, the source says.
And Marie Antoinette.
She followed him to the guillotine 9 months later.
The execution of the king. The source links this, plus the war and the deep divisions, directly to the revolution entering its absolute worst phase.
Its most violent and turbulent phase, yes. The stakes were incredibly high now. France was at war externally and deeply divided internally. This paved the way for the radicals to take full control.
The Jacobins again.
Yes. In June 1793, the radical Jacobins purged the National Convention of their more moderate rivals, the Girondins. They seized control.
And they started implementing really radical policies.
Extremely radical. Trying to remake society completely. The source mentions things like introducing a whole new calendar, trying to de-Christianize France, an attempt at total transformation.
Which leads us to the Reign of Terror.
La Terreur. Yeah. The infamous Reign of Terror. It lasted about 10 months. The Committee of Public Safety, which became the effective government, was increasingly dominated by Robespierre.
And its purpose?
Officially, to protect the revolution from its enemies, internal and external. In practice, as the source states, it meant hunting down and executing suspected enemies of the revolution by the thousands, mostly using the guillotine.
Suspected enemies? That sounds terrifyingly broad.
It was. It could be anyone perceived as lacking revolutionary zeal. The horse gives a chilling figure. Over 17,000 people were officially tried and executed during the terror. But it also notes many, many more died in prisons or were killed without any trial. An unknown number, really. It was the revolution consuming itself.
How did this period of intense violence finally end?
Ironically, it ended with the execution of the man most associated with it, Robespierre himself. He made enemies. People feared he'd target them next. He was arrested and guillotined on July 28, 1794.
And his death marks a turning point.
Yes, the beginning of what's called the Thermidorian reaction.
Thermidorian reaction, meaning?
The source describes it as a moderate phase. Essentially, people in France recoiled from the sheer brutality and excess of the terror. There was a widespread desire to pull back from that extremism.
So an attempt to find stability after the chaos.
Exactly. The National Convention, now dominated by the more moderate Girondins who had survived the terror, drafted yet another constitution. This one was approved on August 22, 1795.
What kind of government did this new constitution set up?
It created France's first bicameral legislature, a two-house parliament, trying to create more checks and balances, perhaps.
And who held executive power?
It was placed in the hands of a 5-man committee called the Directory, or Directoire. These 5 directors were appointed by the parliament. Again, maybe an attempt to prevent one person, like Robespierre, from gaining too much power.
Okay, a five-man executive, a two-house legislature. Did the Directory manage to bring stability?
Not really, no.
No.
According to the source, its 4 years in power were pretty disastrous, riddled with financial crises, popular discontent, inefficiency, and above all, political corruption.
So France is still unstable, still struggling.
Very much so. And because the Directory was weak and unpopular, it increasingly had to rely on the army to put down protests and maintain order.
Relying on the army. That sounds dangerous for a civilian government.
It was. The source knows the directors had ceded much of their power to the generals in the field. They became dependent on military force.
And waiting in the wings is a certain ambitious, successful young general.
Napoleon Bonaparte. He'd made a name for himself, was popular, seen as effective.
So as people got more and more fed up with the Directory's failures and corruption,
The stage was set. Napoleon saw his chance. On November 9, 1799, he launched a coup d'etat.
overthrew the Directory.
Swept it aside, yes.
Yes.
Abolished it, and basically appointed himself as France's first consul, giving himself supreme power.
And that moment, Napoleon's coup, the source identifies that as the end point.
Yes. That event marked the end of the French Revolution and the beginning of the Napoleonic era.
Wow, what a journey. 10 years. Going through that History.com article, it really hits you the sheer speed and intensity. From a bankrupt monarchy facing protests through declarations of rights, terror, different governments, and finally landing with Napoleon in charge, it's dizzying.
It truly is astonishing. And the source helps us see how this decade unleashed incredible forces. It showed the raw power inherent in the will of the people
Yeah.
to tear down an old order, even if the path forward was incredibly complex and often brutal.
It definitely laid down ideas that shaped modern democracies, as the source implies, but goodness, the human cost along the way.
Absolutely. Those ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, they resonated and continue to resonate. But the reality on the ground during phases like the terror was horrifying.
It makes you pause, doesn't it? Thinking about how much happened, how much changed in such a compressed period.
It really does. And maybe a final thought for you to consider based on everything we've pulled from the source. How do we square those things? The incredibly inspiring, noble ideals laid out in documents like the Declaration of the Rights of Man, with the brutal reality of the terror just a few years later. What does that inherent tension between the dream and the reality tell us about the nature of deep, fundamental societal change?